It was 6 o'clock sharp on a Monday evening in October of 1989. The kind of evening when the sky over the Blue Ridge turned the color of bruised peaches and the cicadas screamed from the hedgerows. Elijah Boone should have been in his recliner. That was the truth of it. He should have had the television glowing in his dark little rental house in Virginia. A tray of meatloaf, green beans, and cornbread cooling on his lap. A tall glass of sweet tea sweating on the coaster beside him. Pat Sajak should have been spinning that big wheel while contestants stumbled over puzzles Elijah had already solved in his head. That was the rhythm of his days now, predictable as the sunrise. Instead, he stood in the parking lot of Osborne's funeral home in Baker's Gap, Tennessee, his cane planted firm on the cracked blacktop, his hip already aching from the drive. The glass doors reflected the gold streetlights, and through them he could see the glow of chandeliers. The blur of people moving inside. The sign on the door read, "In loving memory of Thomas Abernathy, 191-31989. Elijah stared at the name until the letters blurred. Thomas. His best friend. His hunting partner. The boy who had once saved him from drowning in the Clinch River when they were 12. Now laid out cold. And Elijah had come home to say goodbye. The words people used in moments like this never sat right with him. Passed on. Gone to a better place. No. Dead was dead. And Thomas was dead. Simple as that. But Elijah knew, in the marrow of his bones, that there was nothing simple about it. He tightened his grip on the cane and swallowed hard. The October air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. He thought about turning back, about driving the hour and some change over the state line to Randall's house, slipping back into his chair, pretending the world hadn't shifted. But the pull of the past was too strong. He had left Baker's Gap 15 years ago, after Lydia died. He had managed for a while, rattling around their old clapboard house on the edge of town. But after the third time, he fell down the basement stairs breaking his hip so bad it required a steel rod. Randall had come and fetched him. "Dad, you can't live here alone anymore," Randall had said. "You'll kill yourself." Elijah had fought him tooth and nail. But when his son mentioned how much the grandkids wanted him close, his will crumbled. And now, standing outside Osborne's, cane digging into the asphalt, Elijah realized he was more a stranger to his own hometown than a son returning. The Gap had changed. He had driven through Main Street before coming here. The old general store where he used to sneak colas after Sunday service was gone, torn down to make way for a food city. A quick sudden service gas station squatted where Mr. Lanning's hardware store once stood, its bright neon sign flickering blue against the evening. The church on the corner, rebuilt in the 60s after the old one burned, still smelled faintly of new brick and paint even 2 decades later. Progress, they called it. But to Elijah, it felt like a kind of forgetting. He remembered when Baker's Gap was little more than a scatter of clapboard houses, a schoolhouse with a bell tower, and the diner where Lydia used to wait tables before they married. Back then, people waved at you from their porches, and if you had a problem, half the town knew before sunset. Now there were subdivisions stretching toward the hills, full of folks who didn't know the history of the land they lived on. The history mattered. At least it had to Elijah. And to Thomas. His hip gave a sharp twinge, pulling him back to the present. He leaned heavier on the cane and forced his gaze back to the glowing funeral home. Inside, voices rose and fell. Laughter and tears braided together the way they always did at visitations. It wasn't just mourning. It was remembering. Measuring a man's life by the crowd that came to see him off. For a moment, Elijah thought of Lydia again. The last time he had stood in a place like this was for her. That had been the hardest walk of his life down the aisle of the parlor, past the casket, feeling everyone's eyes on him as though he were the one who'd died. He had left the Gap not long after because he couldn't stand the silence of the house without her. But tonight he couldn't escape. Tonight was for Thomas. A car pulled into the lot beside him, headlights washing him in white. He blinked against the glare until the engine cut off. The driver's door creaked open, and a petite woman stepped out, her hair iron gray and clipped short, her handbag swinging at her side. She straightened her skirt, glanced up, and her whole face lit with recognition. Well, if it isn't Elijah Boone. she said with a smile. They'll let just about anyone in here, won't they? Elijah's mouth curved despite the heaviness in his chest. Good evening, Margaret Carver, he said, his voice catching. She crossed to him in 3 brisk steps and folded him into a hug that smelled of lavender and starch. For a moment, he let himself rest in it, the warmth of an old bond. I knew I'd see you here tonight, she murmured. You boys always showed up for each other. Of course you'd be here. Elijah pulled back enough to meet her hazel eyes. I'm the only one left. Margaret. Her expression softened, lines deepening around her eyes. She cupped his cheek the way a mother might. Not the only one, Elijah. Not while you're still standing. The words struck something deep in him. For a heartbeat. The ache in his hip and the years between seemed to fall away. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Come on, she said gently, nodding toward the doors. Let's go in. Folks will be glad to see you. Elijah looked past her at the glow of the chandeliers, the shadow of the coffin at the far end of the parlor. His chest tightened. He wasn't ready yet. Not quite. In a minute, he said softly. I just need a little more time out here. Margaret gave his arm a squeeze. Then let him be. She walked up the steps, her heels clicking, and disappeared through the glass doors. Alone again, Elijah drew in a slow breath and let his gaze drift over the lot. Trucks, sedans, cars with Virginia plates, and even one from Kentucky. Thomas had people from all over, it seemed, and every one of them carried a piece of the man Elijah had known better than anyone. Yet there were things about Thomas no one else knew. Things Elijah himself sometimes wished he could forget. The shadows lengthened, and the night closed in around the funeral home. Elijah felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. He tightened his grip on his cane, squared his jaw, and finally began the slow, painful climb up the concrete steps. Whatever waited for him inside, he would face it. For Thomas, for the past, and maybe for the things that refused to stay buried. Elijah leaned back in the armchair, watching the line snake toward Virginia and her daughters. He should have joined it. Every tick of the clock reminded him. Yet the weight of unspoken words held him pinned. The conversations around him blurred into meaningless noise. He let his eyes drift shut, and the memory of Thomas's last letters rose up as if summoned. The first had arrived 3 months back, in an envelope marked by Thomas's crooked hand. Inside, the words trembled with unease. Eli, there's folks sniffing around the gap. Strangers in city suits, pale as bleached bone, eyes like they ain't seen sunlight in years. Asking about land, asking about keepers. Who talks like that? Virginia said one woman came to the door while I was out dressed like she'd been rummaging through church bazaar bins. All scarves and shawls. She asked what happened to the cattle in Collins's pasture. Ain't been cows there since before we were born. Gives me the shivers. Eli, don't sit right. I figure you, of all people, will understand. Your old friend, Thomas. Elijah had read the letter 3 times over, then lit a cigarette, though he hadn't smoked in years. He'd kept the letter tucked in his Bible, as though scripture could guard the words. More letters followed, then late-night phone calls. Thomas's voice low and urgent over the crackling line. They're watching. Eli, he'd whispered once. I swear I saw 6 of them by the reservoir. Young, old, men, women skin pale as paper, eyes too dark. One fella tipped his hat and called me keeper of the pasture. Then they all laughed like it was some joke I wasn't in on. Each call ended with the same plea. Come back. Eli, we can't ignore this. Elijah had promised he would. But the week stretched, and his body betrayed him, hip aching, chest wheezing. By the time he'd packed his bag, the call came that Thomas was gone. Now, sitting in Osborne's parlor, Elijah pressed his knuckles to his lips. He should have come sooner. Should have stood with Thomas one last time. Dad? Randall's voice broke the memory. You all right? Elijah forced a nod. Just thinking. Randall gave him a searching look, but didn't press. He moved off to fetch coffee, leaving Elijah with the hum of voices and the throb of guilt. That was when the air shifted. A ripple passed through the crowd near the entrance. Subtle, yet unmistakable. People stepped aside, their conversations faltering. Elijah followed their gaze. A young man had entered. He was of medium height, dressed in a black suit tailored too perfectly for this small-town funeral. His hair was neatly cut, brown and glossy. His face, handsome in a forgettable way, was marked by eyes too wide, too sorrowful, as though he carried grief not his own. Elijah's stomach knotted. Something about the man was wrong. The stranger paused at the little sign bearing Thomas's name, studying it with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Then he stepped deeper into the room, his gaze sweeping over the mourners. For the briefest instant, his eyes met Elijah's. A chill ran from Elijah's tailbone up to the crown of his head. Recognition pricked at the edges of his mind, maddening in its elusiveness. He knew that face or some echo of it, but could not place where or when. Before he could dwell, a group of women bustled past, blocking his view. When they cleared, the stranger was gone. Elijah scanned the crowd, heart pounding. Conversations resumed. Oblivious. Nobody else seemed disturbed. Randall returned, setting a styrofoam cup in his father's hand. Here you go. You look like you saw a ghost. Elijah grunted, sipping the bitter coffee. He didn't dare say it aloud, but maybe he had. Minutes later, he spotted the stranger again, this time near the refreshment table. Mrs. McAllister was smiling at him, giggling like a girl. The young man leaned close, speaking in a voice too low for Elijah to catch. The sight set Elijah's teeth on edge. It was too smooth, too practiced. A flim-flam artist. Maybe. But something deeper tugged at Elijah's gut. The same instinct that had once saved his life in the woods when he and Thomas were boys. Then the man vanished again, swallowed by the shifting crowd. Elijah's grip tightened on his cane. He felt the stirrings of the old fear. The kind that slithered out of the dark hollows of memory, the same fear Thomas had written about, had begged him to face again. He thought of the letters, of the pale outsiders who spoke of keepers and pastures, who laughed at things no decent soul should laugh at. And he wondered, with a dread that hollowed his chest, had one of them walked into Osborne's tonight? If so, they weren't here by accident. They were here for him. Elijah's knuckles whitened around the cane. His eyes darted through the parlor, searching for that black suit again. The stranger moved like smoke, slipping between mourners, present one moment and gone the next. Each glimpse sent a shiver crawling up Elijah's spine. At last, he saw him again, too close for comfort. The stranger had cornered Margaret Carver and another woman near the receiving line, speaking in a low voice that made Margaret tilt her head, her polite smile fading. That was enough. With a grunt, Elijah pushed himself to his feet. His hip flared hot, but he ignored it, leaning hard on the cane as he made his way across the crowded room. Each step drew curious glances. He was moving faster than he should have, the wood of his cane striking the floor in sharp staccato. Margaret caught sight of him over the stranger's shoulder. Her face brightened, then shifted to alarm as she saw the set of his jaw. She raised a hand as though to intercept him, but Elijah was already there. Stop right there, Elijah rasped, his voice carrying farther than he intended. The room hushed, conversations faltering. I know who you are. You and your kind sniffing around land that ain't yours, bothering good people who've suffered enough. You won't have your way here. The young man turned slowly, those wide, sorrowful eyes fixing on Elijah. For a moment, the two stared at each other, and the world seemed to tilt. The parlor, the voices, the chandeliers, they fell away like scenery in a play. Elijah felt the air thicken, as if he were standing underwater. His lungs seized. His cane trembled in his grip. He was looking into those eyes, brown, soft, familiar. Not the eyes of a stranger. The eyes of a boy. Elijah, the man said quietly. And though his voice was deeper now, older, it carried the same lilt Elijah remembered from the hills. It's been a long time. The years peeled back in Elijah's mind. He was 12 again, barefoot in the woods, laughter echoing around him. He saw the faces of the boys he had grown up with, Thomas among them, of course, and others now long gone. And there was one boy in particular, always quick with a smile, dirt on his knees, mischief in his eyes. Caleb Whitford, the boy they had buried. Elijah's throat closed. His grip loosened, and the cane nearly slipped from his hand. This ain't possible, Elijah whispered. We laid you down ourselves. I saw the earth cover you. The man smiled faintly. Not cruel, not mocking, but sad. You saw what you were meant to see. Margaret glanced between them, bewildered. Elijah, what is this? Who is he? But Elijah barely heard her. Memories surged like floodwater the pact they had made as boys, sworn in whispers beneath the cliffs by the reservoir. The night the darkness rose from the water, and Caleb had screamed, and afterward they'd all sworn never to speak of it again. And yet, here he stood. The stranger Caleb reached out, almost as if to steady Elijah. Easy, Eli. You're not crazy. It's me. Elijah staggered back a step, shaking his head. No, this is some trick. Another one of those pale devils in disguise. Caleb's eyes softened. You feel it, don't you? You know me. You always did. The cane rattled against the floor as Elijah's knees trembled. He remembered that night, the wet stink of moss, the moon cutting silver across the reservoir, the way the water had boiled though no wind touched it. He remembered Thomas's hand gripping his, both of them pulling Caleb back from the brink. And then the scream, the silence, the body that wasn't right. They had told the town Caleb died of fever, buried a closed casket, and they had carried that secret like a stone in their guts ever since. You shouldn't be here, Elijah whispered. If you're him, you were never supposed to come back. Caleb's faint smile turned grim. None of us were supposed to live past that night. But the curse doesn't care about should. It only waits. Margaret's face blanched. Curse? What are you talking about? Elijah shot her a look sharp enough to silence her. This ain't your burden. Margaret, leave it. The old teacher pressed her lips thin, but she obeyed, retreating into the crowd. Elijah turned back to Caleb, his voice shaking. Thomas, was it them? Those pale-eyed bastards? Did they do it? Caleb's gaze drifted toward the casket across the room. He started asking questions. That's enough to get you killed when the keepers are watching. But I swear to you, Eli, he didn't go down alone. He fought until his heart gave out. The rest, well, that's why I'm here. Elijah's breath came shallow, ragged. His hip screamed, but he barely felt it. His mind reeled with images he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury a pact. The curse, the thing beneath the reservoir. You're saying it's back? Elijah said. After all these years. Caleb's eyes darkened. It never left. The word struck like a hammer blow. Elijah swayed, nearly toppling, but caught himself on the cane. Around them, the parlor noise slowly resumed. Mourners resuming their conversations as though nothing had happened. Nobody else seemed to notice that the dead had come back to life, that old secrets had clawed their way out of the grave. Only Elijah. And now, there was no running from it. That night, Elijah sat awake in the spare room at Randall's house, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above him. The house was quiet. Randall, his wife, and the children long since asleep, but Elijah's thoughts refused to still. He heard the echo of Caleb's words. It never left. He had wanted to dismiss it as madness. Yet the memory of those dark-eyed strangers Thomas described, of the pale suits haunting the old pastures, gnawed at him. And Caleb himself standing flesh and blood before him was proof enough that what they had buried was not gone. A floorboard creaked. Elijah turned his head. Caleb was there, standing in the doorway, the hallway lamp behind him casting his figure in half-shadow. He wore no suit now, only a plain shirt and trousers. But the years still sat strangely on him, as though time had skipped and stuttered. You couldn't sleep either, Elijah said. Caleb stepped inside, pulling up a chair. Sleep is for men with no ghosts. You and I don't have that luxury. Elijah pushed himself upright with a grunt, wincing as his hip flared, then spit it out. Tell me what's coming. Caleb's gaze was heavy. The ones Thomas wrote about, they aren't buyers or wanderers. They're keepers. They serve what lies beneath the reservoir. They watch the land, the bloodlines, waiting for cracks in the silence we swore to keep. Thomas dug too deep. They silenced him. Elijah's throat tightened. And now they'll come for the rest of us. They already have. Caleb said. I wasn't meant to walk this long road. I should have stayed down there. But I was pulled back maybe by the curse. Maybe by something else. Either way, I'm here. And so are they. Elijah swallowed hard. He felt the weight of his age pressing down. Every ache and tremor of his body reminding him he was no longer the boy who once ran wild through these hills. But another voice inside, stubborn as bedrock, whispered that he couldn't walk away. Not when Thomas had died fighting. Not when the curse had returned. What do we do? Elijah asked. Caleb leaned closer. We end it. Tonight. The reservoir lay 2 miles outside Baker's Gap, where the hills sloped down into a basin of black water. Elijah and Caleb walked the dirt road under the silver wash of the moon. Elijah leaned heavy on his cane, each step a battle, but he refused to turn back. The trees rustled as though whispering secrets. The air grew colder the nearer they came to the cliffs. Elijah smelled the water before he saw it had damp, metallic scent that always set his teeth on edge. The cliffs loomed, jagged silhouettes against the sky. Below, the reservoir lay still as glass, reflecting the moonlight in fractured shards. And they were waiting. Figures emerged from the tree line, half a dozen. Maybe more. Men and women of all ages. Dressed too neatly for the wilderness. Their suits and dresses clinging like second skin. Their faces were pale. Eyes deep and dark. Pupils swallowing the moonlight. One stepped forward, a tall man with slicked hair, his lips stretching into a smile too wide. Keeper, he said, his voice smooth as oil. We've been expecting you. Elijah gripped his cane tighter. I ain't no keeper. The man tilted his head. Oh, but you are. You kept the secret all these years. Kept it buried. But now, the silence phrase. His gaze slid to Caleb. And the dead don't stay put. Caleb stepped forward, fists clenched. We're not here to talk. The man's smile sharpened. Then let us end it. The keepers moved as one, gliding closer. Their eyes gleamed, their mouths stretching open too wide, rows of teeth glistening like wet stone. Their shapes seemed to waver, as though flesh were only a mask over something else. Elijah's heart pounded, but he planted his cane in the dirt, raising it like a staff. Come on. Then, he growled. The first keeper lunged. Elijah swung the cane with all his strength, the wood cracking across its skull. The figure shrieked, a sound like metal scraping glass, and crumpled before rising again, face already knitting back together. Caleb barreled into another, driving it toward the cliff's edge. They grappled, fists flying, the pale creature hissing like a snake. Elijah fought with desperate fury. Each strike of the cane jolted pain through his hip. But he pressed on, smashing, jabbing, driving them back step by step. Their claws tore his coat, raked his arms. But he refused to fall. Eli, Caleb shouted. The water. Elijah understood. The reservoir was their source. If they could drive the keepers into it, maybe the curse would claim them. With a roar that tore his throat raw, Elijah swung wide, knocking one of the creatures sprawling into the dirt. He stomped forward, cane raised, forcing it back toward the edge. Caleb wrestled another, both teetering on the cliff. The tall man sneered, his voice carrying over the chaos. You cannot fight age. Elijah Boone. You cannot fight death. Maybe not. Elijah rasped, sweat stinging his eyes. But I can fight you. He drove his cane into the man's chest with a strength born of rage and love and years of silence. The keeper staggered back, eyes wide, arms flailing. Elijah shoved harder, his own body screaming in protest. The man toppled over the cliff, vanishing into the black water below. The others shrieked as though bound to him, their forms unraveling, faces twisting. One by one, they stumbled, fell, dissolved into shadow that streamed toward the reservoir. The surface rippled, then boiled, then stilled, swallowing them whole. Silence fell. Tin Ninda Duok Thursday Hoy. Tin Ninda Duok Thursday Hoy. The following morning, Elijah moved like a man stitched together with wire and prayer. Every joint ached. His hips screamed with each step, and his arms were mottled with bruises. Yet when Randall helped him dress and drove him back to Osborne's for the final service, Elijah felt lighter than he had in years. Inside the parlor, the air was quieter now. The crowd had thinned. Only family and the closest friends remained. Virginia Abernathy sat near the casket, her daughters flanking her like sentries. Exhaustion etched into their faces. Elijah leaned hard on his cane, what was left of it after the night's battle, and made his way across the room. Randall hovered close, but Elijah waved him off. This walk, painful though it was, belonged to him alone. Virginia looked up as he approached. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to rise. But Elijah lowered himself into the chair beside her before she could. His breath came shallow, but his eyes met hers steadily. "Virginia," he began, his voice rough. "I don't have words fancy enough for what you deserve. I can't say the usual sorry for your loss. That don't cover it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she stayed silent, listening. "Thomas," Elijah continued, "was the bravest man I ever knew. He carried more weight than anyone realized, and he bore it with his head high. He didn't deserve the way he went. But I swear to you, it wasn't in vain. He fought to the last breath, and I'll see to it that fight means something." Virginia's lips trembled. She reached out, her hand small and fragile against his weathered knuckles. "He always said you'd outlast him. Said you had too much stubbornness to quit." Elijah gave a faint smile. "Stubbornness is about all I've got left." They sat together in silence, the casket looming before them, the air heavy with grief but touched now with a fragile thread of peace. When the time came, Elijah stood among the mourners at the graveside. The preacher spoke words Elijah barely heard. Dirt thudded onto the coffin. Virginia wept softly, her daughters holding her steady. And Elijah, though his eyes burned, stood tall, cane planted firm, bearing witness. 2 days later, Elijah rode back with Randall to Virginia. The road wound through the hills, the autumn leaves blazing red and gold. Elijah stared out the window, the landscape blurring. He carried the memory of the reservoir in his bones, the hiss of the keepers, the crash of the water, the weight of his cane driving one into the abyss. He carried Thomas's laughter, Caleb's impossible return, the pact of silence that no longer held. At Randall's house, the grandchildren swarmed him, their small hands tugging at his sleeves, their voices bright. Elijah smiled, patted their heads, let their warmth soak into him. But his mind drifted back to Baker's Gap, to the reservoir, to the shadows that never truly left. That night, sitting on the porch, he felt a presence beside him. He turned and there was Caleb, just for an instant, leaning against the railing, boyish grin flashing in the moonlight. Then he was gone, like mist burned away by the sun. Elijah closed his eyes. Perhaps Caleb had been real. Perhaps not. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Elijah knew his role now. He was the last watchman, the final guardian of a secret older than the hills. And until the curse came calling again, he would keep vigil. And now, dear reader, the story rests with you. Elijah Boone chose to fight, though his body was broken, though the odds were against him, though the years had stolen his strength. He stood because someone had to, because silence was no longer enough. But what do you think? Was he right to fight that battle? Or was he just an old man raging against what cannot be stopped? Violence, injustice, and the burdens we carry, these are not just the stuff of ghost stories. They are the fabric of our lives. Some believe there are fights worth waging even when defeat is certain, because standing up is the only way to keep the world from sliding into shadow. Others say wisdom lies in letting go, in saving what little strength we have for peace. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, do you believe some battles, no matter how hopeless, are worth fighting? Or should we learn to walk away? The hills may hold their secrets, but here, your voice can be heard.